We're Laura and Cindy, and you're listening to the Holistic Horsemanship and Husbandry podcast, where we talk about natural horsekeeping and deepening your connection with your horse. I'm Laura, your horse care mentor. I teach natural horse management practices after working with over 200 horses and seeing how current industry standards are compromising the health of the horse.
And I'm Cindy, your horsemanship mentor, offering a proven and unique approach to creating deep connections with your horses from 20 plus years of experience, including working with wild Mustangs. If you enjoy this conversation, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you're listening to us so we can get this podcast into the ears of more passionate horse people. Today, we're going to be talking about winter and our horses and how we approach the changing of the seasons with our horses and some of the things that we've seen over our many years of horse enthusiast. And the first thing that I want to do is talk about that changing of the seasons and what is actually happening. I don't know about where you guys are in relation to where you live, but we here are in the high desert near the Sierra Mountains. And interestingly enough, we all started seeing our horses begin to shed like late August, which was crazy early. But I didn't see a whole lot of hair growth, just the losing. So horses shed twice a year. They start to shed in that fall time, getting the winter coat, and then they'll shed their winter coat as soon as the temperatures start getting warmer. And so when they shed out their summer coat and start getting their winter coat, there's this fascinating thing is the epidural layer of their skin starts to produce a waxy layer. And we don't really see it as much as we feel it. So in the wintertime, when we are like scratching on them or rubbing on them, the tips of our fingers will get that kind of like gray film on it. It's kind of waxy feeling. What that layer is doing is insulating their body, their skin. It's waterproofing. It's a waterproofing system. Would you say waterproofing, Laura, or would you say water resistant?
It's insulating and water resistant.
Yeah.
Because it's thickening and water resisting.
If a horse is standing in the rain long enough,
they are wet to the bone.
Soaked to this, yeah.
Yeah.
They are soaked through and through. They are chilled. So yeah, I think water resistant is the best. And because all of our bodies produce heat, that waxy layer heats up. And it works as a way of insulating them. So the winter coat has a shorter coat and a longer coat. And what's really amazing about one of the amazing things about these animals we call horses is that when it's cold, they have the ability to make their hair stand up, which gives them that velvety look, right? Where we love to go put our hands in and our hands sink down. That's because their hair is standing up, their fur is standing up. So the wind travels through that fur standing up, and it actually, in those shorter hairs underneath, it captures the wind and holds it against that waxy layer that's heated up on their body. And it actually warms that air up and helps insulate them and keep them warm. Pretty fascinating.
Yeah, nature was not messing around when it designed this system.
But if they get soaked, if they can't get out of the rain and the rain and the wind or the snow and the wind is the killer, then you're going to get a horse chilled to the bone, shivering. And I'll tell you what, the most heartbreaking thing I ever see to this day is 1,000-pound horse shivering.
Yeah, it's really sad. And you'll know the difference about when they're soaked to the bone or not, because when you part the hair on the inside is dry. You can see it very easily. And so sometimes if I go out and it's one of the first cold days of the year and MJ's shivering a little bit, but I can part her hair and it's dry, I let her tough that out a little bit because she needs to acclimate to the changing temperature. But if she is soaked, and I don't think that her body's going to be able to keep up, then I'm getting her under cover, I'm getting her dry, I'm feeding her up, I'm doing supportive things to help her out. But if she's just a little bit uncomfortable on the first day of winter, I give her a hug and a kiss and tell her I love her and that she's going to be okay.
And when you see that, Laura, and you're like, okay, this is the now we're really changing, mother. Summer's not teasing us anymore. It's gone. And you're gonna let her toughen it up. Would you give her a little extra hay in that moment just to help her toughen that up?
Yes, absolutely. Just a little, like I have some just very plain alfalfa pellets. And if I'm really feeling nice, I'll put a little warm water in it for her. But what I'm not going to do is run out and put 10 blankets on her, or get my hair dryer, or, make large efforts to cover up her coldness. I will boost her system to help her manage, but I'm not going to bring out all of my comforts of home from my worst winter day and use them on the first day of winter.
So when you find her shivering and she is soaked and you have to intervene, and it happens even to the best of us, it happens.
Yeah, I mean, we have 50 some odd horses at our barn. So even if we get surprised by a rainstorm, we have no barn. We have shelters, but we have no barn, and they have to come out of the shelters to eat and drink. So if we get surprised by a windstorm, we just can't get all the blankets on the horses by the time they're soaked. So some of them are going to be cold and wet if we get surprised and we don't, if it's not in the forecast the day before. It happens.
And so when you come out and you find a horse cold and wet, shivering or not, I mean, sometimes if you won't know they're shivering until you really look close. The first place I notice it is on the hindquarters.
Oh, interesting.
Right
I
there
always
by
see it in
the
the pecs.
Interesting. I noticed it in the hindquarters, the poverty groove, which is that back by their tail. There's this groove by their, what we would call not their glutes really, and the hammies, right in that
Like
area.
the intersection of the glutes and the hams.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Or near the flanks. But yes, you're also right, the pecs. So whether they're shivering or not, but you can tell they're soaking wet in there and it's cold. And for me, when I see a horse and I know they're miserable, it's like any time when they don't feel good. The ears are out like Eeyore, the head is down, the look is like within themselves, or like they're moping, just like a wet dog. So you come out and you find one like that, Laura. Tell us what you do.
I start by we have a little covered arena, so I'll just chuck them in there and get them out of the elements. And then depending on that horse, like if it's a big horse with a lot of body heat, that horse is going to dry itself pretty quickly. If it's an old horse, a skinny horse, something else, some warm mash to help warm them up. If they're like really wet, some towels. They make blankets that wick moisture off your horses. I don't personally own one, but they're not bad to have. They're a good investment. And in that situation, that would work well. I'm kind of keeping an eye on them. Is their stomach really sucked up? That tells me they haven't been drinking a lot of water. So then I'm going to come in with some supportive, like warm water with the molasses or something like that and get that hydration going. I'm just doing whatever I can do to get them comfortable. If I don't think that they're really exhausted and they're not an exhaustion risk, I'm going to encourage a little bit of movement and kind of kick up the system and get it going. But if it's like an old horse I'm generally worried is exhausted just from being cold, I'm just going to do everything I can to rub that horse off, get it dry. Actually, at the horse rescue that I volunteered at, when I first got MJ, we would bring them into the greenhouse and dry them with a hairdryer. And
That's
you'd
a
be
good
amazed
horse.
at how untrained a horse can be. But when they realize that air is warm and it's nice in that greenhouse, they're just perfectly happy to stand there.
That's funny. Here where I'm at, I have pastures with shelters, and I have a couple. I have one Mustang who, well, she's got to be in her late teens by now, but she looks like an appendix quarter horse. And those guys tend to be more thoroughbredy, thin-skinned, and she lives with a porker, so the other Mustang, like, he's got more insulation on his body than he needs. He eats faster than her. And so it's always the juggling act. She's one that I will often find shivering, and she's wild enough that I cannot put a blanket on. I cannot towel dry. I cannot halter, but she'll be shivering. So the first thing, and really the only thing that I can do, is I feed a grain supplement that's not high in sugar but high in fat, and I will put hay in front of her and put it in the shelter, get her out of the elements. And by the time I'm done feeding everybody and I come back and check on her, she's settled down. She's not shivering, she's drying off. But yeah, otherwise I do exactly the same thing that you do, Laura, is, well, I don't have a covered anything that I can bring my horses into other than the shelters. But even when I lived in Truckee and I had insulated stalls, the first thing I do is bring them in and get them out of the elements, offer them that. I like to offer them warm water with molasses in it because it's got that sugar salt ratio, and get food in front of them. And if I need to put a blanket on, like Laura said, you got to towel dry them really good. You can't, unless it's a water wicking blanket, you can't put a blanket on a wet horse. It traps that moisture in. And then for me, changing of the seasons, and because I have mostly Mustangs and pretty hardy horses out here, I don't blanket. I've been here for 10 years. The coldest we've been has been 9 degrees, and I have never blanketed any of them here, nor have they needed to be, thank God, because I let them change out with the seasons. And let me say, my horses are all, for the most part, are all very healthy. And I have to backtrack. I have one horse rescued from the kill pen who's an old retired ranch working horse who has the sway back that just looks like it's got to be painful.
Yeah.
And I did have to blanket her first winter here. She was so malnutritioned, I did have to blanket her. But I know that where you're at, you have more situations where you need to blanket. So let's talk about blanketing.
Yeah. So as Cindy and I were kind of talking about before we hit record, in a perfect world, your horse does not need a blanket. But there's a lot of horses in imperfect worlds, and I'm one of them. I never ever blanket for warmth. I'm only blanketing for waterproof. My blanket is just a rain sheet. And I think that's really important because people chronically over blanket their horses, and it can get up to 65 degrees in the middle of the day in the winter here. And so
what happens when you over blanket them and leave them on all day?
let's pause for a moment. Have you ever looked at your horse and wondered if they're thriving in your care? Is there more you can do to give them the best life possible? Most ranches and boarding facilities are set up for convenience, not horse health, but there's tons you can do to fix your horse's situation if you're willing to get creative. Join Evidence-Based Horsekeeping, my Facebook group where members learn how to improve the mental and physical well-being of their horses. The link is in the show notes. Well, they just get sweaty and rain roddy, and it can make them sick because they get sweaty and then they're wet all the time and they get funky skin. It's just like a steamroller of issues. And they get super itchy, so then they're trying to get it off, and then they get it stuck on things and rip it. Like, you just don't want to deal with an over-blanketed horse that's like constantly sweaty and wet and eventually has a compromised immune system.
So it's kind of like us when we layer in this time of the year and we're too hot. We want to take that off so our skin can breathe and let go of that sweat and stay dry. But horses can't do that.
Yeah.
Over blanketing is a good.
It's not a like, oh, I'm cold, so my horse must be cold situation. If your horse is standing there smiling at you, not shivering, not wet, they're probably fine. Now, unblanketed horses, when they are young and strong with tough immune systems and healthy bodies, they have that good waxy layer. They have a good winter coat. They have the ability to get out of wind and rain, which are the two things that can cut the waxy layer. They probably don't need a blanket. They're better off without one. But if you're like us, we have shelters and trees and all kind of stuff, but we don't feed under those. We have too many horses to feed everybody under cover, and we don't want them fighting over who gets to eat under the cover, so they all eat out. And so I don't want MJ skipping a meal or going out and getting soaked because she didn't skip the meal and then being cold and miserable. So she wears the rain sheet. Most of the horses at our barn wear a rain sheet. That's one example. If you're in a really cold area, snow is not a big deal. Horses can have snow on them. It actually creates an insulated layer and it's fine. But if it's going to snow and then melt and then blow, you're going to have a problem with a wet horse in a windstorm. So if your horse can't get out of the elements, they need a blanket. And in the horse world, there's this like sense of pride thing that's like, well, I'm a true horseman, so my horse doesn't need a blanket because I know what I'm talking about. And it's just not that simple. It's, you're either in a perfect world where your horse has all the protection they need or you're not. We have some horses at our barn that are older and they have trouble keeping weight on in the winter. We're not going to ask their bodies to work over hard. We put a blanket on them and keep them nice and warm so that we don't have to feed them, things like powdered, super hot supplements to get weight back on. We'd rather just keep them warm and have their bodies not working as hard.
So I'm thinking of the perfect world. What does that look like? In a lot of ways, where I'm at, all my horses are out to pasture, so they have freedom to roam and run and play. They have shelters they share, and they do use them and get in out of the rain. When I have a newbie in a pasture, I know that that one's not going to get to be in the shelter, so I move them up to another area where they do have their own shelter. But is my place perfect? No. I can't bring one in out and doctor them. I do have a shelter that has a panel across it with the gate. So if they have to be locked up long enough to dry, that can happen. Laura's in a situation where there's 50 horses, and I believe they're all out to pastures, right?
Yes, they are.
With shelters.
Shelters, yeah.
But they're communal shelters.
Yeah.
So the low man on the totem pole is not going to get to be in the shelter, and often the low man on the totem pole is the youngest or the oldest or the weakest. So that's the need for the blanketing. Then there's facilities who everybody has a stall and paddock of their own, and they're still being blanketed. So when you blanket your horse, you have to understand you are taking their ability to grow a winter coat away from them. And the more that you blanket, the sooner you start blanketing as it starts getting cold, and the longer those blankets are on, and the number of days that those blankets are on, is going to determine whether or not your horse grows an adequate winter coat to keep them healthy. I'm not sure if you said it, but I know that it's probably the case. When it's a nice sunny day, do you have your rain sheet on?
Absolutely not. We are on and off all winter, and I make my schedule on when I go to the barn versus for the days that I need to blanket and unblanket, and we help each other, and like we are very proactive in that.
Some boarding facilities, the horses will have their blankets on at 4 o'clock until 9 or 10 o'clock the next day when it's warm enough to take their blankets off.
Right.
The reason it has to be warm enough is because they've deprived them the ability to grow that winter coat. So you have to make some pretty clear, conscious decisions, and you have to stay with them. Another reason that people blanket their horses so their horses don't grow a coat. Why is that, Laura?
Because they don't want to have this wet, shaggy, muddy mess that they can't ride immediately when they want to.
Yeah. A lot of people in those boarding facilities, the only true exercise that the horses get is when they take them out and ride them in the, if they're lucky, indoor arena and the outdoor arena on a nice sunny day. But when you have a long winter coat, they're going to sweat faster. And depending on the time of the day that you're riding them, a lot of people can't get out there until they get off of work, and the sun goes down where we are at, the side of the valley I'm on, the sun goes down at 3 o'clock in the wintertime. And so all of those factor into why you would want to blanket your horse through the winter and not affect their health. In the wintertime, if I decide to go, and I bet you do the same thing, Laura, in the wintertime when I decide to go trail riding, I don't do it too soon in the morning and I don't do it too late in the afternoon. And I make sure that my horse doesn't get too sweaty, because as that sun drops and as that temperature drops, my horse gets chilled, and that's how you get sick horses in the wintertime. What about your approach?
I'm very lucky in that MJ's just not a very sweaty horse.
Oh,
I get a lot of leeway with that. But it just comes down to knowing your horse. If you have a very sweaty horse, you're gonna have to be smarter about it. Also, MJ, she's a light riding horse, so we're never riding above a walk anyway. When you have your horse in the winter, it's okay to do a lighter ride so that they don't sweat, even if you have to go after work. And if your horse is sweating profusely at a walk, your horse is having emotional discomfort being ridden, and that needs to be addressed before you put them under any more stress because that poor horse is not having a good time.
yeah, that's a great point. That's a whole nother episode that we're going to do is that emotional wellness and how your horse is feeling. The emotional part of the horse, a horse who's, yes, stressed and emotionally not doing well, they will sweat excessively and they will sweat all over their body. Like
Yeah.
horses don't normally sweat on their faces. If you have a horse who's sweating around the eyes or sweating uh over their whole body instead of like their shoulders and their pecs and their hindquarters, you have a horse that's stressed.
Yeah.
And so that's what Laura means by the emotionally not doing well and not having a good time. And that needs to be investigated. And that I think we'll get on another episode. A lot of people will do blanketing because they show and they clip their horses. And I mean, I know a lot of women who totally body shave their horses at the beginning of every winter. And those horses wear heavy duty blankets. It's not for me,
Yeah, that goes against my personal ethos of horse keeping.
but that we all have horses to fulfill our own individual needs. The only thing that I hope that's going on is there's as much consideration about the horses' emotional needs and their mental fitness and their overall well-being as there is for the individual's personal desires to have their goals met with their horse, meaning I want to show, I want to jump. It's got to be Laura and I share in this philosophy. If your horse is not enjoying it as much as you are, then you shouldn't be doing it with that horse. Or at least investigate with a horsemanship mentor on how to holistically create a partnership with your horse, meaning how do I help my horse mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually enjoy what we're doing together? And that's what our holistic horsemanship podcast is all about. Traveling. Sometimes in the winter time, if you're going to travel with your horse, depending on the trailer that you have. If you have one of these fancier, newer trailers that completely enclose and you can open the windows up and you have the vent up above, you probably don't need a heavy blanket on your horse. Their body heat is going to heat that sucker up. I had a friend who kept a thermometer in the inside part of the horse trailer, and it was mind blowing. And actually, I think one of the universities did a study on this where they kept a thermometer in a variety of different horse trailers and saw the temperature. And actually, it might not have been winter; it might have been summer to show how hot those trailers got. But the point is, you guys, like you and I get in the car with our two dogs, and that thing heats up fast because of our body heat.
Yeah.
But if you travel with trailers like Laura and I have that are more open, I have I'm trying to remember Laura's, but mine for sure is a stock trailer.
Mine is like a pseudo, it's open. I can't close the windows.
Right. So they're getting more air and more draft and potentially sometimes even wet.
Yeah.
So I have been known when I lived in Truckee, which is like at times of the year, it's the coldest place in the world. But anyway, I would blanket my horses if I had to travel somewhere. And sometimes I would get to the destination and I felt really bad because they were sweating underneath. So what do you do, Laura, when you go traveling? Because I know you have the luxury of going to clinics and stuff year round. We don't have that here.
Right. I only blanket if it's raining. I don't want her to be soaking wet. But if it's not raining, she's fine. And but one thing I do because I travel is if there's going to be a significant weather temperature change on the other end where we're overnighting, like if I go to visit Cindy, I will bring a warmer blanket. So I have a lot of blankets with zero fill because those are what I use the most. But then I have one up where I'm not going to ask MJ to just raw dog a complete change in temperature and location and lifestyle like all in a 24-hour period. I'm going to bundle her up, treat her like a princess, keep her warm. I'm not asking her to acclimate to the weather somewhere where I'm going for just the weekend and then coming home.
Right. I mean, that's the quickest way to get a colicky horse
Yeah.
or to get a respiratory issue on the back end of it when you get
Yeah.
home. I remember when I first started having to think about blankets was when we moved to Truckee from the Bay Area in California, which is, in my opinion, like the best temperature in the world. I mean, the
Yeah.
best seasons
Like
in the world.
very mild all around. Yes.
I mean, and that being said, their cold is more damp than
Yes.
high desert cold. Like I remember in the Bay Area, the cold would get you to the bone, where here we can layer it out. But when I first started getting into blankets, I didn't know this, and I didn't really have anybody that knew, a lot. I was at the time a backyard horse owner.
Yeah.
Um, if you're going to blanket your horse and they're not locked in a box stall, which then you wouldn't really need a blanket, but make sure your blanket is waterproof.
That's 1,200 denier or higher, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. The
They
entire
will say
tightness
waterproof.
of the stitching. So
Yeah.
like the cheap blanket is gonna be that 800 denier. It is not waterproof.
But the waterproof blankets will say on them, waterproof.
But they do not always stay waterproof forever, especially if you make the mistake of putting yours in the dryer or washing it with a very heavy duty soap detergent. So
Yes.
what I always do is at the end of the year when I wash my blanket, I hose it down and then I look very carefully underneath it to see if it's soaking through, in which case I re-waterproof it or get rid of it.
Just make sure, because if you put a blanket on a horse that's water resistant or doesn't say waterproof, you're doing more damage than you would do if you just left the blanket off completely. Ready to unlock true freedom with your horse? Join Unbridled Freedom, our private Facebook group for women on a spiritual journey in horsemanship. We don't fix our horses, we transform ourselves. This is your space to embrace challenges, celebrate victories, and deepen your bond with your horse. If you're ready to lead with wisdom, compassion, and inner peace, join us today. Let's dance with our horses as one. The link is in the show notes below.
I made that mistake on a very, very sweet, very old stallion, my first winter blanketing horses, and there's no worse feeling. I felt horrible. Came out the next day. He was miserable. He was freezing, and it was all my fault. I felt so bad. You do not want to feel that feeling.
No, you can get a very, very sick horse.
Yeah.
If they don't colic, you're very lucky. And if they don't end up with an upper respiratory, you're very lucky. So let's move on to winter and hoof care. So because Laura is our hoof care expert, and when I say expert, that doesn't mean that we know everything there is to know and that we don't make mistakes. What it means is we have devoted ourselves to being an ongoing student of that topic.
Yep.
So take it away, Laura.
So your big issues are ice, snow, mud, and that brings on thrush and to shoe or not and what that all entails. This is where I really, really, really love boots because horses and winter and shoes are a yucky combination because of snowballs, slipping on the ice, and getting shoes stuck in blankets. And all of those things scare the living daylights out of me. And if your horse doesn't have shoes, you don't have to deal with any of it. But if you want to go ride on the trail and it's a little bit icy or a little bit snowy, you can get boots with studs, which are amazing.
Oh,
Horses can, like, I've seen horses be able to pull carts. Like, horses can do major athletic feats in these boots with studs. So highly recommend those. But then you're also going to look at mud and wetness. People get really worried about thrush and other like abscesses and that kind of stuff. And yes, it is an issue, but I'm going to remind you that thrush comes from poop, not wetness. So just keeping, even if you have a lot of mud, keeping the poop out of it does a lot. And then you're going to want to pack those hooves with Artemud clay to keep thrush at bay. And if your nutrition, which is what we're going to talk about next, is solid, you should be able to weather some wet hooves without major abscesses.
so go back to that clay. What is it called? Can you spell that?
Artemud, Artimud.
Perfect. And where do you get that?
I buy mine on Amazon. I'm sure there's better small businesses you could support. They also make a product called mud grids, which you can buy from agriculture supply stores. And they're like giant Legos that click together, and they are amazing for mud control. They're about a 2-foot square. And I'm going to be watching the muddiest parts of MJ's pasture and putting them in where I need to. And they're super removable. So even though I'm boarding and I'm not, wanting to invest lots of money, I'll just pick them up and take them with me when I leave. And they'll be something that they have a lifetime warranty or a 20-year warranty or something like that. And they're really good for those muddiest spots of your pasture. It's not like a footing that you have to keep replacing. It's a big plastic grippy grid. Control your muddiest areas. Pick hooves often. Like just refreshing what's in there helps keep them packed, keep them dry, pull those shoes, and try not to spend all winter freaking out about your horse's hooves because I see that a lot. You only can do your best.
And if you're in a situation where you can't control that mud, again, being able to clean those hoofs as often as you can. And when you do clean them, if you can take them somewhere drier
Yes, even just
for an
getting
hour or two.
for even 20 minutes makes
Yeah.
a huge difference.
And one of the things that I like to do when I'm luckily I'm on a 6% grade, so it drains pretty good here. But when I've had places where I've had my horses that suck off my muck boots, what I would do then is I would get them out and clean their hoofs and walk them up the road and get them on that little bit of a harder, drier surface. And my horses are 90% of the time no shoes. So getting them out on that harder surface and helping them just to really contact that frog and pump that blood and get the air. And, it's all just really good for them from the mind down to the hoof.
And that's where asphalt is kind of a catch-22, and you have to choose what's best for you and your horse because it'll be slippery, but it's not like gravel can be very hard. If your horse is really foot tender with wet feet, your horse might be having a miserable time on gravel. And asphalt is much better because it's a smooth, flat, hard surface that isn't going to be like uncomfortable points. We have where we are, our driveway is super slick, but the road that goes around our neighborhood is actually pretty aggregate-y and not as slippery. So I do this funny like zigzag out the driveway where I touch the driveway as little as possible, crossing through the grass. And then once we're on the road, I don't worry about it. But MJ's also not a super spooky horse. If she was super spooky and jumping up and down and sliding, I might make a different call there. So you have to use your discernment and know your horse the best to make that call. But if you can make it happen, a walk on asphalt is really good for the hooves.
Some places will have DG if they have a lot of, mud issues, and the longer that DG gets walked on and stomped on, it becomes very, very hard. And that's another good alternative. Basically, really, if you can just get those hoofs clean and give them 20 minutes or more of just being dry, that makes a huge difference. The next thing that we're going to talk about is the feeding during the winter time. I'm going to start because we have little Fee with us today, who is like, I think she'll be 5 months. So she's a little active in Laura's arms. So Laura's muting herself so you guys don't get to hear her gooing and gawing. So I'm going to start and then Laura's going to kick in. I feed here. I have 13 horses, and for the past 20 years, at least, I have fed a good quality grass hay straight across the table. At one point, I had an equine metabolic horse who couldn't have high sugar and high starch. And I literally had a gal in our area that grows and tests her hay to make sure it's low in sugar, low in carbs. And she would get that hay. But otherwise, I feed straight orchard grass across the table. In the wintertime, I give them a little bit more based on their weight. I start at the end of summer, increasing their hay a little bit so that I get a nice layer of fat across the rib cage. The way that I test my horses to see if they're of good flesh, I mean, it's obvious to see if a horse is fat. And it's obvious to see if a horse is skinny because their hip bones are sticking out. You can count every rib. Their withers are high. Their shoulder bones are sticking out. But how do you tell if a horse is at good flesh? In our veterinary practice, we tell our clients to take 4 ounces of pressure along their dog's rib cage, and they should be able to feel their fingers bump over each rib cage. You can do the same thing with horses, but you apply more like 8 ounces of pressure, and you should be able to feel your fingers bounce over each rib. Now, not dip into the valley in between the ribs. You feel the ribs under your fingers like you're going over speed bumps. The harder you have to push, the more insulation they have. The less you have to pressure you apply, the less insulation, aka fat, they have between their skin, your fingers, and their ribs. So I am rubbing my fingers along every horse, all of including my wild ones have learned to let me do this. I do it at least once a week because a horse can lose weight quickly without you knowing it. But as we're getting out of summer into fall, I'm rubbing my fingers and I'm slowly increasing everybody's hay, especially those, like I have 4 here that tend to be underweight. I'm pumping their food up as much as I can without everybody else stealing it. On cold, rainy, windy, wintry days, I will, if it's been cold all day and it's going to get colder at night, I will give everybody a half of flake of either mixed, meaning grass and alfalfa, or straight alfalfa. So they'll get their regular grass and then they'll get a half a flake. Everybody gets. Some, I have 2 here that I literally have to pull out in the middle of the day and give them an extra mixed flake during the winter time to keep their weight on them so that I don't have to blanket them. All of my horses get a supplement. They get a grain supplement every morning, small amount, so that they can get their supplements, like vitamins, or I have some allergy horses, some that have, arthritis. That's how I give them their supplements. And the other thing that I want to make sure is that my horses are drinking. Now, there's a lot of debate out there on the temperature of your water troughs. I do not have the ability to put water heaters in my water troughs. So my horses have cold water in the winter time. We're out there first thing in the morning, breaking ice and throwing ice. If the ice is an inch or more thick, I'm throwing ice. Actually, probably a half an inch. I'm throwing it off the trough because I don't want the sun to be working hard to melt the ice. I want the sun to be working hard to bring that water temperature up the best it can. So I throw my ice. My horses, and I learned so much from the time of managing 130 wild Mustangs. What I learned is that horses, contrary to what everybody believes, can actually go 24 hours without water. We don't like it. We don't want them to, but they can. They drink more in the summer and less in the winter. I fill my water troughs once a day in the summertime and every 2 days in the wintertime. I have had horses who seem dehydrated. You can tell they're sucked up in the flanks. Laura's going to talk more about that because she's got that more. My setting is more el natural. Laura's is more urban husbandry. So I love our combo together because you get both. You get to understand what to do in both situations. I have come out in the morning where a horse doesn't look like they feel good or they don't dive into their food. The first thing I look at is their flanks. Are they sucked up? Does their stomach look higher up in the flanks is that spot between the body and the back legs. For those of you that are beginners, we want to make sure that we help you understand. What I will do is I will go get a 5-gallon bucket of hot water because I have to hike up to the house. And I will put a cup of molasses in it, mix it up real well, and take it down to that horse. That horse usually, actually, honestly, my husband has to. Otherwise, I slosh it all over, and it's 2.5 gallons by the time I get there. And every time I do that, they will normally drink down that entire 5 gallons of water. And that's awesome.
And something important about this conversation is that flavor and drill has been introduced before you're in crisis.
Yes.
You're not like, oh, here's a new thing you've never tried.
So what do you do to make that happen, Laura?
You offer it to them on a random day. Like, here, have a nice treat.
And it kind of goes with that trailering in the wintertime, right?
Yeah.
Laura and I teach all of the horses that we are ever going to be traveling with how to drink out of a bucket. Because if they're ever sick, like I had one horse get herself stuck up in the wire and she was down for 24 hours. She wouldn't stand up. And so I had to take water to her. It was summer, and I had to take water to her, and it was filled with molasses. And she sucked down every time.
Yeah.
So we play. It's one of those fun things, right? Today we're all going to learn how to drink molasses water out of a bucket.
Yeah.
A handheld bucket.
Yeah.
So that's what I do here on the ranch during the winter time. Sometimes I'll come out and have a colic. They don't want to eat. They're not thrashing, but they don't have good gut sounds. The most important thing to do is call your vet, take their vitals, listen to the gut sounds, walk them. I have 2 here on the ranch that walking does nothing. But if I put them in the horse trailer and drive around town, drive around for an hour, pulling over periodically as soon as they poop, then we go to Starbucks and we come home.
That's for
they're happy and healthy. And my husband and I get a Starbucks. So what do you do, Laura, for your feeding on your setup?
So I'm going to try something new this year. So the way my barn works is our hay is covered with our board and we're welcome to as much like extra as we want. Like all the horses get fed just a set amount based on how your pasture is looking in the morning and night. But if you want to come in the middle of the day and feed your horse more, you're welcome to do that. Take it off the pile. But my barn feeds a 3-way grain hay that I don't love, and I'm just trying to keep MJ's starches in check. I pull her blood every year to make sure that her body's handling it, and she's fine, but I still just don't really want to add more starches to her body. So I'm going to try to source some really good meadow grass hay and throw her an extra flake of that every time I'm there this winter, and I need to get on that. I'm choosing meadow grass over orchard because we're learning, the more research that's coming out is actually getting your horse's microbiome used to a super varied diet is really, really good for them. It can be challenging to find a meadow grass that doesn't have rye in it, which is kind of a bad guy. So I'm gonna have to do a little research and I'll just buy orchard if I can't find that. That's my goal. I've, seen MJ go through enough winters where I know she's a hard keeper in the winter and I know she looks totally fine until about mid-February. And then all of a sudden it's like, damn, my horse lost 50 pounds last week. Once that happens, getting her back up is really hard. So I want to get ahead of that. And so even though she is plump right now, I will still throw in that extra flake of hay. Now, I'm not saying she doesn't have a crusty neck. She doesn't have a single fat pad on her. But for me and how I see her weight changing, she's at her plump season, but I'm not going to delay supplementing because what I don't want to end up doing, where I ended up last winter, is on a powdered weight gain supplement because those are really, really bad metabolically. I immediately saw more flaring in her hooves. Like I just saw negative effects her weight came up beautifully, but I see negative effects all over the horse elsewhere that I don't want to deal with. So if you get in that situation and you have to use one of those short term, use it. Keep an eye. But if you can understand what's happening with your horse and get on it early and fix the problem with forage instead of fake sugars and chemicals in a powder, that is a way better way. And so that is kind of what I'm trying to do preventatively this year. With our waters, we only get like maybe 1/8 of an inch of ice and the horses plunge right through it. We don't heat our waters. We don't ever get that cold for that long. So it's just not an issue. Now, if I travel somewhere that's going to be really, really cold, I am going to be prepared to offer MJ some warmer water because I know she's a little bit picky about that. For our day to day, I do not warm her water. I want my horse to thrive without me. And then I have all my extra tricks and my molasses water and my things, just like Cindy, in the bag if I need them. I'm not going to go, oh, I'm cold today, so I'm going to give you some molasses water. No, I want you to know that you go out and you drink your water and you're just fine. If I see an issue, I'll address it, but I'm not going to baby you to the point where you need your molasses water on Thursday at 4 o'clock. Otherwise, you're going to colic.
Giving the molasses water is if you're doubting whether or not your horse is drinking, offering like a gallon, which is like a little bit of flavoring. That's a good way just to make sure they're drinking.
But yeah, don't get them used to being super babied for no reason. Because then when you go out of town, you're going to have problems. We want our horses to be independent and robust. We don't want them to need us for all their creature comforts all the time.
Laura, that point right there is worth its weight in gold. I learned that from the Mustangs. I was a Bay Area, California girl all my life with horses, and there's a lot of pampering that we did. And a lot that we didn't have to do because the weather was so good, right? I mean, the biggest thing we had to worry about was that boot sucking mud and the heat, too hot. But when I moved up to Truckee and had, 6 foot of snow and 10-degree temperatures and all these people telling me I had to do all these things, which ultimately made a very hardy, healthy horse a very colicky horse. And eventually I lost him to colic.
Oh.
And then working with the Mustangs and having them pulled off the range in the middle of winter and put on 650 acres, 130 of them, talk about stress, and then talk about food. And they weren't getting the highest quality of food because it was a rescue. And I mean, I learned in a hurry how much we make our domestic horses dependent upon us. We deprive them of the opportunity to use their natural God-given.
And in some ways, we take away their ability to just cope with a little bit of discomfort.
Do as little as possible. Would you say that that's the golden rule?
Absolutely.
Do as little, less is more.
I'm never going to make my horse suffer. Never. But I'm also going to wait until she shows me that she needs something before I step in with it.
Yeah.
She showed me she needed that blanket. She came from Idaho. I was like, you don't need a blanket. You're in California. You've weathered some serious, serious winters where we used to go out with a sledgehammer and go through 6 inches of ice on the pond that they drank out of. And most of the time, they'd gotten to it before we did. Tough horses. And she was like, well, I'm a California girl now. And she spent 24 hours in the shelter not coming out because it was raining. And it was like, oh, you need a blanket to act like a normal horse. So I'm going to accommodate you. Even though I was like, at the time, I was like, this is ridiculous. This horse is fine. But she wasn't, and she needed it, and that's okay. You can't be stuck to a high horse philosophy either direction.
And it's different. When I lived in the Bay Area, I was acclimated to that kind of environment. And then when we moved up to Truckee, oh my God, my first winter, I was sure I was never going to survive. I wasn't sure we were going to be there for winter too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now I do fine. And I remember when I started running when I lived in Truckee, and then we went for vacation down to Southern California. And I was amazed at how much easier it was to run in Southern California than it was in the mountains.
Right.
So yeah, it's the same. I wanted to add one more thing that you made me realize that I forgot. In the wintertime, we have basketballs
Mm.
floating in all our water troughs. And the theory there is that the wind will blow it and agitate the water. And so it takes the water longer to freeze. Maybe I'm not out there watching every hour,
Right.
but we leave them in year round because from a distance, if we can't see that basketball, then we know that trough is getting lower than we want
Oh,
with water.
nice. Yeah.
But what I learned from the Mustangs, the pastures that have Mustangs that were actually in the wild, when their troughs freeze and the water's frozen underneath that basketball, but it's not as thick, right? Because the basketball is there. At first, I would come out in the morning and the horses that had Mustangs in there, the basketball would be on top of the ice and there would be a hole, that's ice, and they were drinking out of it. Sometimes I got to witness one of the Mustangs going over and pushing on that basketball until it popped through that ice, and then they'd roll it over and drink. So they learn how to break that ice as long as it's not, an inch or more thick, then that's kind of hard for them.
Pay attention to your horses this time of year. You're going to learn a lot about them. They're going to tell you what they need. And if you meet those needs, you got a good chance of having a nice, healthy horse through the winter.
And if they have a two-sided, preferably three-sided shelter of some sort to get out of the wet and wind, it's the wind that gets them more than the wet. So, I mean, I have horses across the street from me that don't have any shelter, and it absolutely breaks my heart. But I also see them, this is the 10th winter. I mean, they have lost some horses in the winter time, but most of them do fairly well, but it's heartbreaking. Anything else we're leaving out here?
I think something to just be aware of is that horses actually struggle in the heat way more than they struggle in the cold. People get all bent out of shape about winter, and it's okay. They're going to be okay. They are tough in the cold. MJ would be easier to manage in like true cold weather than in just wet mud, which is what we have. Have some cocoa, give them the day off.
I mean, the one thing we didn't talk about that I think is worth mentioning as we close on this conversation is we take in 6 to 7 gallons of oxygen into our lungs as we fully expand our lungs. Horses take in 60 to 70 gallons of oxygen, and oxygen comes from air. And if it's too cold for you to go out there and take nice, deep, 10 deep breaths without it kind of hurting your esophagus and your trachea down into your lungs, please don't ride your horses.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I
By
mean, you
doing
could
better, I
walk
mean
them.
in the pasture, not working.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't exert them. Don't bring their cardio up and make them fill their lungs, because you can literally do damage to the lung capillary, the capillaries in their lungs. I see people here in this valley riding their horses in 22-degree weather because they haven't ridden for 2 or 3 days, and they are bringing up that cardio and making them really take in that full 60 to 70 gallons of ice cold air, and it's you're not doing your horse a favor. So just be mindful. I mean, I don't know how many of you, I think that most of us who live in that kind of cold weather know, but there's also a lot of us who are just relocating with our horses.
And there's a lot of pressure if you're in a more of a performance world where you have to work your horse all the time or something bad's going to happen.
Yeah.
And we should do another episode on that. But if your horse is truly emotionally accepting their job, they can go a week or 2 weeks and they'll get right back into it and they'll be okay. And if your husbandry is in place so that they have a large area to move around in and play with their friends, they're not going to get that out of shape.
I had shoulder surgery and could not handle horses for a year. I mean, literally, I was not allowed to halter them and walk them around for a year. I mean, I could have if I didn't want to fully heal, and I am fully healed, stronger actually than I was before I had my surgery. I picked my horses right back up. My horses all have 2 or more acres. So they were out there living the horse life. I don't even think that, I mean, well, I have a couple that I think missed being ridden, and Laura had her baby,
And MJ's been hurt. Like MJ and I have taken more 6-month breaks, so many 6-month breaks. And she picks right back up. And there was a time when she was out of shape because she was confined, but if she's with other horses, she's decent. She's not, gonna go win Tevis or anything, but she's not saggy.
And I think that's another episode. I think physical fitness would be a good episode to have, because I have a different opinion on my horses out of shape. My horse has to be worked every day because they're not physically fit. If you want to come up with a winter program for your horse to help keep them physically fit, mentally stimulated, and emotionally balanced, let's talk. We can help you out. If you guys have any questions on winter care, you can always go over to our Facebook page, Holistic Horsemanship and Husbandry, and let's have a conversation over there.
If you're wondering how to best set up your property or wondering how you can optimize your care for your horse in your current boarding situation, let us know what you're working with. We're more than happy to help.
So if you have any questions about the topics covered in this episode, send us a message on our Facebook page, Holistic Horsemanship and Husbandry, and we will answer your question in a post on our page. You will be anonymous. We'll just take the question and provide our input, and we want to do it on the post so that we can all learn and grow together, because nobody knows everything. Thank you for tuning in to another episode. We want to remind you that we'll be here every second and fourth Tuesday of the month, following the golden rule. Have a plan, but always be willing to be flexible. Don't forget to connect with us using the links in the show notes below.
If you learned something new today, had an aha, or walked away with a valuable nugget, you can say thanks by leaving us a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening on.